I stayed at Nick's far longer than I ought to. The guy was rarely ever home anyway, spending most of his time either working overtime or helping at his brother's garage. Nick didn't talk much about his brother, but he seemed to be a hard-working, red-blooded kind of guy. Nick would only talk about him in ways that would start with, "This one time, Tommy did the craziest shit, I crashed on the couch. My place needed some serious renovation, and the only one able to do the work was this carpenter from the Babin apartment complex. I only saw him in passing. He had the look of a hunched-over vulture in human form. Nick advised me not to set foot near my place until the guy was done through and through. You don't want to meet Roy, he said. Guy's a freak." One night as I lay awake on the couch, Nick tiptoed past me to get a midnight beer. I waved an arm at him. "I ain't sleeping," I said. "No need to sneak. I'm just light on my feet," Nick said, wandering over. "You want one?" "What the hell?" He handed me a beer and slumped down on the lazy boy chair next to me. We looked at the TV. It was still on, but there was a countdown warning us about it shutting down in about a minute after prolonged inactivity. "Some kind of power-saving thing. I still can't believe this shit," I muttered. "There are, actual unreal things out there." "Yeah," Nick sighed. "Takes some time to wrap your head around." "How far does it go?" "Like demons? Angels? That kinda thing?" "I dunno. Maybe." Nick shrugged the question off, downing 2 big gulps of beer in one go. He sighed, leaning back in his chair, suddenly looking a lot more tired. He wasn't gonna make it back to bed. "I guess it's just one of those things." "Just one of those things, huh?" He shot me a final tired look, cracking a coffee-stained yellow smile. "Don't pretend like you knew how the world worked before you got here, rookie. You had no idea." I mean, he wasn't wrong. Nick was out like a light, leaving his beer dangling from his hand. I plucked it from him, keeping it from spilling all over the carpet. Looking back at those early days, any normal person would have left town long ago. But it wasn't that easy. I got the impression that making too much noise might get you in trouble. And not just a little note on your personal record kind of trouble, but the kind of trouble where you're pushed into a van and never seen again. Nick was one of the most relaxed people I'd ever met, and even he spoke of the DUC like they were boogeymen. The Department of Unknown Crises. What the hell kind of name is that? The good thing about being far down the chain of command is that you're rarely involved in big picture stuff. The sheriff and his coordinators spent days on their own, leaving ordinary officers like Nick and I to deal with the day-to-day issues. We caught a guy speeding, checked out a couple of broken windows, helped a drunk guy get home. Nothing out of the ordinary. And for most of January, and the start of February, that was it, that is, until we got a call about the Rosemills. The Rosemills worked at the local middle school. They were a husband and wife of about 50 years old. You could spot them sometimes sitting together at the local cafe, talking away for hours. It was kinda sweet to see 2 people so in love, even after more than 2 decades together, reportedly. I didn't know them personally. But still, I'd hate for something to happen to them. They seemed like decent people. We got a call that the Rosemills hadn't been seen for a while, and we were asked to do a wellness check. Nothing out of the ordinary, we'd done a couple of those at that time. So off we went. It was the last thing Nick and I were supposed to do that day. It was late afternoon, and the sun was already setting. We rolled up to the Rosemills home, parked our car, and stepped out. Having a quick look around, I could tell something was off. Nick stopped when he realized I wasn't following him. "No tracks," I said. "No one's been around for days." I could tell what Nick was thinking pretty well by now. He was thinking that maybe they'd skipped town. Without saying a word, I shook my head and pointed a flashlight to the side of the house. Their car was still parked there, covered in snow. "All right," Nick sighed. "You go out back, I'll check the shed." Roll back in 5. There was a broken window out back. And a couple of snowed-over tracks leading down a hill. Signs of a struggle. Possibly a second set of tracks, but it was hard to tell. It kinda looked like someone had either jumped out or been thrown out a window. I called it into Nick with my radio and followed the tracks. As I peeked over the edge of the hill, my heart dropped. The lady of the home, Lacey Rosemill, lay dead about 20 feet further down, impaled by what looked like a long steel rod. I yelled at Nick to hurry on over. I was already on my way down the hill, calling it into dispatch. I spoke out my last name, badge number, address, victim, and reported as a suspected 187. Seconds later, I heard Nick following me down the hill. As soon as he saw the body, he also called it in. Cancel that, dispatch, he added. Patrick's out. Lacey Rosemill was dead in the snow. Face down, with a frozen pool of blood spread out underneath. She'd done her best to get away. Signs of struggle on her arms. Buried in her back was what looked like a piece of sharpened rebar. The tail end of it was longer than my arm. I looked at Nick, dumbfounded. He rolled his eyes. This happens sometimes, he said. Didn't I mention Patrick? You got a killer on the loose. I snapped back. And you're not doing anything. It's not like that. Come on. He brought me back up to the house. The front door was open, and the hinges were barely holding onto the stale wood. The house was covered in this cheap peeling paint, leaving flakes of green and white across the porch. As we stepped inside the house, flashlights at the ready, Nick explained, Patrick isn't really his name, it's just what we call him. Patrick. Like Bateman. American Psycho, you know. And you're not putting him away. Not even after this. There's no point, Nick continued. The guy just kinda comes and goes. I saw him get hit by a truck once, and a couple of days later he walked out of Lake Adibat like nothing happened. People don't work like that, Nick. People don't come back. Who said he's people? As we moved through the house, I got the impression that Nick was looking for something. He kept checking for trapdoors and hidden compartments. Thing with Patrick is that he doesn't just kill anyone, right? He kills just the right kind of people. What's the right kind of people? The kind of people that'll end up hurting a whole bunch of other people in the long run. I helped Nick flip over a dinner table, checking a storage compartment connected to the kitchen floor. Nothing but old booze and a couple of valuables. Nick didn't seem interested. A couple of years ago, there was a guy who lived out by St. Gall, right? And he had this, let's call it unhealthy interest, in some of the locals. Now, the guy hadn't done anything yet, but we all got the creeps from him, and we didn't really know what he was up to. Nick turned to me, making a finger gun. I could see my reflection in his pink sunglasses. Pow. Out comes Patrick, taking the guy out with a piece of rebar fired from a homemade crossbow. Whole thing's made from an old Volkswagen spring leaf. That thing could behead a goddamn rhinoceros. But the guy hadn't done anything. True, nodded Nick. But the sick shit we found in that old-timer's hippie hut sure indicated that he was about to. And that's the thing with Patrick. It's like he just knows when shit's about to go down. I was starting to get the idea. Nick was looking for whatever had caused Patrick to attack these people. In his mind, there had to be some kind of reason behind the violence. A justification. We searched for about half an hour before we ended up in their bedroom. Going through their clothes, I don't even know what we're looking for, I admitted. Like guns. Sometimes it doesn't show, said Nick. But Patrick never fails. Not once. If you end up killing people, indirect or otherwise, he might have something to say about it. Doesn't that mean that him not killing this Digman guy means Digman's off the hook? I said killin' people, rookie. Digman and his kin ain't people. Finally, something white reflected back at me. A box of something in the back of Lacey Rosemill's wardrobe. I brought it out for Nick to see. It wasn't anything incriminating. It looked like a box of unpainted Halloween masks. Plain white, with black straps. Some of them had an air filter. Others had black felt to hide your eyes. They looked pretty expensive, but I'd never seen anything quite like it before. They weren't factory made. There were too many imperfections, like the faces had been carved out by hand with a fine tool. There was a shipping stamp on the side of the box, indicating they'd ordered it from somewhere about a week prior. I picked a mask up, looking it over. It had a strong jawline and an ambiguous smile. This one's kinda handsome, I grinned. Nick rushed over, almost tripping over his own feet. He smacked the mask out of my hands, bruising my thumb. Before I had the chance to protest, he pointed at me. Don't fucking touch these things. Don't. After that, things turned into a circus. Nick called it in. and this time we caught some attention of the higher-ups. Apparently, the masks were noteworthy. I didn't really get it, to me it was just a box of masks. And we still hadn't found the husband, he was still out there. I ended up working overtime. As the sun set, I sat down with Nick. We'd just finished putting up the tape over the doors and windows. The Rosemills yard was flooded with law enforcement. Those masks are bad news. Nick explained as the body of Lacey Rosemill was carried off in the distance. We've had some issues with them before. We thought they'd migrated to West Virginia, but they seem to be back. Masks don't migrate, I added. Those masks fuck you up, Nick corrected. And not in a haha kinda way, but like. They mess with your head. So someone handing them out might be bad enough to get Patrick to kill you. Oh, big time, Nick nodded. There's gonna be a manhunt for old Tucker Rosemill tonight. And I don't think anyone's about to read him his rights. Before we called it a night, Nick was asked to make a statement to Sheriff Mason. Meanwhile, I stayed outside, checking out the firepower we'd called in. The equivalent of an unmarked SWAT team, all without texts or markings. Eerie people. The kind of people who don't think twice about putting down a threat. I caught a last look at the box of masks. It was just sitting there in the back of a van, covered with literal red tape. On top was a plastic blue sunflower seal, something to mark the box as something from Tomskog, Minnesota. I thought about how easy it'd be. You could pick up one of those masks in a second, just to try it on. A couple of them looked kinda cool. One of them sort of looked like me, but like an idealized version. A little softer, a little thinner. I'd look good in it. A bit creepy, but good, but looking at the armed guard standing by the van, I wasn't about to take any chances. I may be reckless, but I'm not an idiot. I was still crashing at Nick's place, so I waited for him to come back. I was just sitting in the passenger seat, legs up on the dashboard, dozing off a little. It had been a rough couple of nights. I didn't know what to think of this whole ordeal, but by the looks of it, it was out of our hands. Still, that image of Lacey Rosemill face down in the snow. It felt unreal. People in Tomskog seemed so used to death and destruction that it barely fazed them. Maybe that'd rub off on me over time. As I daydreamed, I saw a new figure wander onto the crime scene. This guy was easily around 6 feet 8 inches. He wore this white poncho with a pair of garden gloves, those with rubber fingertips for a better grip. Tossed over his shoulder was this massive crossbow, along with a makeshift bag of rebar-like bolts. He covered his face with some kind of World War II-era rubber gas mask. Filterless, he sort of wandered onto the scene like it was nothing. I saw how armed men and women made way, letting him pass by unobstructed. Some barely looked at him, as if used to seeing him. I got out of the car to get a better look at him and ended up following him back to the hill where he'd shot Lacey Rosemill. He calmly wandered over to her tarp-covered crime scene, picked up the rebar bolt, and put it back into his quiver. Then he wandered off like nothing'd happened. Seeing a whole crowd of policemen not as much as raise an eyebrow was absurd. This was the bizarro world of police work. A couple of the SWAT guys seemed to have questions, but their superiors just sort of shook their heads at them. The guy just wandered off. As Nick drove me back to his place that night, I couldn't help but bring up the elephant in the room. Before I even opened my mouth, I could hear him groaning. "You really okay with this, Nick?" I asked. "Having people killed. Is that justice?" "It's not. I mean, it's not about that," he explained. "Like it or not, it's gonna happen. It just feels weird. Like we're watching this from the sidelines. We kind of are. Nature's correcting itself." We quieted down, watching the black road ahead. I thought back to early mornings with my mom, hearing her talk about the various dilemmas she'd run into on her patrols. The cut and dry, the black and white. There was no room for interpretation. But here in Tomskog, here we had Patrick. You get a feeling for these things, Nick sighed. Sort of. That night would turn out to be my last night at Nick's. I got a text early the next morning that my windows and floors were all done. I'd need some new furniture, but apart from that, I was good to go. My car had been back from the shop for a while, but it just felt excessive to drive around with both mine and Nick's. We always went to the same places anyway. That morning was an all-hands-on-deck kinda deal. Like Nick had said, Tucker Rosemill was a target. There were pictures of him on the whiteboard by the entrance. People were already out talking to known associates and trying to draw up a timeline. It felt like a reverse murder, in a way. We were looking for the victim rather than the murderer. Nick and I were kept out of it, for the most part. Everyone was asked to call in if we saw Tucker, but apart from that, we were on regular patrol duty. While Nick didn't seem all too bothered by this, I was having doubts. While most of the day was business as usual, I had this sneaking suspicion that some damage had already been done. People were looking at us differently, and I spotted a couple of boxes by some trash cans that looked an awful lot like the one we'd seen at the Rose Mills place. But if these mask things were such a problem, wouldn't they have popped up by now? But despite it all, I didn't see a single mask. I didn't hear a word about them. And yet I couldn't shake this feeling that something was up. That night I went home to my own place, with my own car. I was looking forward to it. A couch to crash on is nice for a couple of weeks or so. But you really start to notice things you take for granted. Like privacy. But as I got in my car, I looked at the passenger seat. There was a white mask there. It was the same that I'd seen back at the Rose Mills place. The exact same. The one I'd wondered about. There were no broken windows, no forced locks, none of it. It was just there. But it didn't feel intrusive. If anything, it felt like it had found its way home. I picked it up. My first instinct was to try it on, but I saw the bruise on my thumb from where Nick had slapped me the other day. It was only a speck of a bruise, but it was there. With a reluctant flick of the wrist, I tossed the mask into the back of the car. Promising myself to get rid of it later, I decided I ought to drop by Nick's brother and give him my thanks for helping with the car. While I was there, I figured I'd check if there was something wrong with the door locks. People can't usually get into cars willy-nilly. Going by the garage, I could tell something was off. One of the doors was wide open, and there was no one around. I parked by the far end of the lot, checking the place out at a distance. No immediate danger, it seemed. I got out and had a look around. There were no cars parked. There was one in the shop, still under repair, but that was it. No one was around. I could walk right in and clear out the register without anyone having the slightest idea. A little plastic sign with a cheerful back and a snap text swung back and forth by the main entrance. I tried giving Nick a call, but couldn't get through. But something tickled my spine. I heard something. Going inside, I noticed something odd by one of the bathrooms. The door was slightly tilted, and the water was still running. Rubber marks on the floor, like there'd been a struggle. In the next room over, I could find a storage space for spare parts. As well as a fresh, empty box. One that looked eerily similar to the one I'd seen at the Rose Mills place, and right next to it, on the floor, was Nick's phone. I must have heard it vibrating. I had a radio back in my car, so I called it in. I mentioned to dispatch that I couldn't get a hold of Nick, and that there were signs of a fight. I was hit back with a deluge of issues. There were people missing from the night shift. Delayed transports. Sudden communication blackouts. It seemed that this entire operation had begun to fall apart, piece by piece. I looked back on my mask, now resting comfortably on full display in the back seat of my car. Could that little thing really be that bad? It was just a thing. While the sheriff hadn't called me in yet, I decided to get back to the station. At the very least to see if anyone had heard something from Nick, I got in my car and headed straight for the station, stopping only for a red light. I took a sharp turn, glancing back to make sure I didn't cut anyone off. I caught something in the rearview mirror, something inside my car. Someone had hidden in the back seat. A second later, they'd put the mask over my face. Now, it wasn't like I changed into a different person. This thing didn't just make me into something I'm not. The only thing I felt as it was put on was this outburst of emotion. Like it was okay for me to act out. Okay to do anything, really. Like the anonymity of this thing was so palpable that it ate away at my inhibitions. I'm not entirely sure what happened next. I remember these weird flashes. I pulled over, opened the back door on the passenger side, and proceeded to beat the ever-living shit out of whoever was there. I just remember a lot of blood and a handful of teeth, and this burning sensation on my knuckles, and laughter. A whole lot of laughter. I think it was mine. What's scary about these masks is not what they do to you right then and there, but what you feel afterwards. In the moment, all you feel is this elation. You can do whatever you want and get away with it. No one can stop you, it seems. It's this sense of ever-growing freedom, and the longer you keep it on, the better it feels, but looking back at it, I could have done anything. I was vulnerable. I could have jumped off a cliff, just because I wanted to feel the wind rush against my arms. I could have dove headlong into traffic for a chance to see a funny face on a surprised driver. There was this endless potential, and nothing to stop me, so with my mask firmly secured, I did as was expected. I went with the flow. It was so easy to meet the others. I could feel them. It's as if my senses were laser-focused to spot the masks in the distance. And we just ganged up. Then we let loose. I remember shooting out streetlights with my handgun down by Frog Lake. We duct-taped a guy to a bench and stole his wallet. Another masked person ripped up a bunch of dollar bills and tried to feed them to the ducks at the pond, but they seemed less than interested. I don't even know who the other masked people were, but we all sort of looked the same, so it just made sense to join forces. There was a lot of broken glass, cuts on my hands, screaming. Someone getting beaten with a chair leg. A fire alarm, a burglar alarm, gunshots, and this endless, ecstatic laughter. I laughed so hard my lungs hurt, and that little voice in the back of my mind that told me stop had just died. To this day, I'm not entirely sure what happened that night. Thinking about how easy it would have been for me to kill, or be killed. It turns my stomach. Everyone just spoke whatever came to mind. There were no filters. Some were screaming the most vile, disgusting crap, others just confessed to whatever they had hidden away in the back of their head. I don't remember half of what I screamed. But I remember one thing. It's hard to forget. I remember us cornering someone, and as I stared into the face of a terrified, unmasked stranger, I screamed at the top of my lungs, "The law ain't shit. You're not worth shit. This is all shit." There were at least 24 of us. Some broke into the high school. Others, myself included, decided to go running into a field. Someone tripped, breaking an ankle. The rest of us laughed and beat them with a shovel. We took turns, made it into a sort of game. I remember the palms of my hands burning. I had shards of glass stuck in them, and I didn't even care to pull them out. At some point I collapsed from exhaustion. I watched as pine trees swayed in the wind. It was a freezing February night, and the sweat on the inside of my mask was freezing. Long strips of my hair turned into icicles. Somewhere in the distance, I heard movement. I rolled my tired head over to the side, looking into the distance. It was a person with a mask of their own, but it looked different. The others turned to him too, almost reverently. This sense of calm fell over us, like seeing an old friend, or a beloved parent. He had this gray hoodie that barely covered his unnaturally long limbs, covered in insect-like thick hair. The mask he wore looked a little different, like an exaggerated Greek drama kind of thing. Except, it moved. Looking closer, it seemed that it wasn't just a mask, that was its actual face. It slowly moved across the field, bowing down to check on us. Every masked person got their straps tightened and a rough hand brushing their hair aside. Like a caring mother tending to its young, it looked me in the eye without a flinch of malice. It was curious. And eager. Joyful, even. To that thing, we had been given an amazing gift. It just didn't understand, and for some reason, I thought it was kinda handsome. By morning, things were dire. I was hypothermic, but the mask sort of muddled the feel of it. Also, the snow was surprisingly isolating. Who knew you could get warm from covering yourself in snow? A handful of us managed to get up and walk through that field in the early morning. Some stayed down, either dead, unconscious, or giggling. It was surreal watching those white masks glisten in the sunlight as we shook and stumbled our way back towards town, but we didn't make it far. I was completely blindsided. Out of nowhere, something smacked me on the side of the head, breaking the side of the mask wide open and sending me crashing to the ground. As the mask broke, my first instinct was to try and put it back on. I didn't even realize I was doing it. My head rung, and I could barely keep my eyes open. I wasn't sure if it was from hypothermia, sleep deprivation, or a budding concussion. Take your pick. It was Patrick, the massive guy with the crossbow. He'd elbowed me to the ground. How a guy his size had shown up out of nowhere was beyond me, but maybe I wasn't really in the best shape to pay attention. He had this hook on his belt that he used to prime the crossbow. He stepped down on the frame, hooking the cable to his belt, and pushing. It clicked, vibrating with terrible force. It was ready to fire. Pulling a slice of sharpened rebar from his quiver, he prepped the shot and looked down at me, as if making a judgment call. He had these terrifying eyes. The skin was so dry that it looked like tobacco, and neither eye was even fully open. He didn't blink. He just looked at me. I hadn't even realized I was scared. It had been so quick that I'd barely registered what happened. But there he was, ready to do what needed to be done. Patrick killed those who killed others, and in my line of work, especially in this town, it was inevitable. I felt this bottomless hopelessness sink into my chest, like a black puddle. I shook my head, turning away. I'm gonna kill if I have to, I shuddered. I might have to. I might. His finger was on the trigger. The rattle of a steel spring, aching to release. I held a hand up, shielding myself, despite knowing that a bolt would pierce straight through me if given the chance. Hell, it'd skewer a car. I didn't know what I'd done that previous night. I could have killed someone. It was a blur. I was a twitch of a finger away from death, but Patrick just turned away, looking over the field. And as casual as taking a breath, he raised the crossbow, and fired. The bolt soared through the air like a whistling rocket, striking a mask wearer in the neck. Even at a distance I could hear a snap and watch as the body went limp. The head almost came clean off, rolling back and forth with a severed spine. That force was terrifying. At close range, that thing would have destroyed me. Without a word, he wandered off, letting the crossbow rest over his shoulder. He was done. I stumbled forward, barely managing to reach an unconscious mask wearer. I fumbled through his pockets, hoping to find a phone. I didn't find anything, so I decided to rip off the mask and hope for the best. Maybe he'd make it. It was Nick. He was in bad shape. Real bad. I rushed to find help. I ended up checking the pockets of the men that Patrick had killed. I'm not going to describe the sensation of rifling through a dead man's clothes, but let's just say it was visceral. He did have a phone though. I managed to get a call through to the emergency services, which in turn managed to patch me through to Tomskog PD. Within minutes, help was on the way. I caught a glimpse of the face of the dead man. Turns out it was Tucker Rosemill, the other half of the duo that had imported these masks to begin with. I sat with an unconscious Nick for what felt like an eternity. He looked weird without his pink sunglasses, almost normal. I figured someone must have gotten to him at his brother's garage. Maybe the same way they got to me, by getting backup keys and hiding in the back seat. By the time medics arrived, Nick was on the edge of waking up. I think I caught a smile as he looked up at me. Maybe he was just happy to see a familiar face, not covered in a white mask. I ain't sleepin', he slurred. It'd take some time to recover. I had to get a couple of stitches for the glass in my hands, but both Nick and I would be on our feet in a couple of weeks. The sheriff granted us sick leave, so that was something. It gave me time to set up new furniture at my place after the Hank Byrne incident. There were no more killings from Patrick for a while. Most of the mask wearers either wore themselves out or accidentally broke their masks over time. There was no one there to fix them or help them. It's as if both the distributor and the mysterious creator had no intention of coming back. I'm not sure why. Looking back at it, that time is a blur, but it evokes the same feeling as dancing on the edge of a cliff. I was just moments away from disaster, and I would have welcomed it with open arms. That awful, wholehearted abandon, infinite seconds of complete, terrifying freedom.